Welcome to Ground Rules, Employment Law over your coffee break. My name's Pam Howland, and I'm here with Jennifer Walrith and Doug Plass. And we are talking today about what to do if the Department of Labor shows up at your business, presumably performing some type of wage and hour audit. We have seen that happen locally where we're at. We've defended clients when they're in the process of working through an audit with the Department of Labor. And those can be some pretty scary proceedings to be caught in. If you're an employer, 100% you want to take a proactive approach to make sure, hopefully, you never end up in that situation. But even if you've done everything right, there still could be scenarios where you're faced with an audit, and there still are some steps you can take now that might make handling an audit a little easier and may result in a better outcome for you if you give it some thought on the front end. So I am going to turn this over to Doug first, because Doug has worked on a number of audits over the last year and has some pretty recent experience to share. Doug, what do you think is the starting point for thinking through how an employer should handle audits?
Well, I mean, think about it beforehand, first of all. Like, if you have the Department of Labor show up at your door, they're going to want a few things, and you might want to think about what that might be beforehand and know where that material is located. They're going to want your wage records and your hour records and all the information about whatever employees you have. So think about where that is, make sure that that is accessible to you. Another thing that I would always say is, if you have an opportunity to have a relationship with an employment lawyer beforehand, have that person's number available, and when they show up, give them a call. So, help guide you through the process, maybe even run down there and help out with it.
Doug just made himself available, so get Doug's number on your save as a contact.
Speed dial number 8.
You can do your own audit beforehand, right? So if this is something that you're paying attention to, and you can, on a yearly or a quarterly or whatever regularly basis, looking at your records, making sure you have them, making sure you have, documentation of what everybody worked, all the proper information about your employees, that's going to help as well, because they show up, you have it already, it's good, go ahead and hand it to them. What else?
So maybe tell us a little bit about what it looks like when tell us a little bit about what it looks like when the DOL shows up for an audit, based on what you're hearing from clients.
Yeah, well, generally what will happen is an investigator with the DOL's wage and hour division will show up at the business unannounced, just walk in, identify themselves, probably give you some identification, and say that, they are performing an investigation, and ask you to make your records and your employees available to them. This can be, pretty scary and pretty disruptive. You don't have to drop everything. You're still running a business, right? So, if you're running a restaurant and they show up in the middle of your lunch rush, you might be able to say, okay, wait a minute, and let me get back to you, But you are going to have to comply, and you're going to have to give them access to all your non-private spaces, and access to your employees, and access to your records. If things are off-site, you might want to say, okay, well, I don't have that here, but here's where we can get it. But you don't really have the ability to resist this completely. But you do have the ability to make sure that it proceeds in an orderly manner that isn't too disruptive to your business.
Yeah. And what we know is, and I think what makes these kind of scary, is the DOL is authorized to do this. So you are going to want to cooperate in some fashion. But like Doug said, panicking if someone shows up at your door, not a good idea. Or being rude and refusing to cooperate, not a good idea. You're going to have to land somewhere in the middle, which probably means bringing them to a waiting area, saying, okay, give me a minute to give it a little thought, call my attorney, see if we can cooperate and get you what you need, but I need a minute to think about it. That is going to be reasonable, right?
Yeah, ask them what all they're looking for too. They may just start barking things, but you might want to say, hey, what all you need from me? I'm going to make a list here, and I'm going to go see what it's going to take to get it to you. So don't do things that make you think they're obstructing them. Do things to make them think that you are actually figuring out how to assist them.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just kind of, as you guys were talking, I was kind of making the list of, we kind of been talking about some of the things not to do, but some of the things that you can do. And what was coming across to me is that you can ask questions, right? You can clarify scope, what the person wants, if they're asking to talk to employees, what employees, who, right? Kind of get the list. That you can kind of keep tabs on what is happening, right? So, if you have an investigator show up and you take them to a room where they can look at documents or talk to people, that you can escort them through your offices, for example, right? You don't necessarily have to let them run amok in the office, right? You can say, okay, here's a space, make sure you know where that is, either identify it quickly or know where in advance. You're going to take someone who shows up in that capacity, right? That you can maybe take notes, right, of what is happening. These are the documents they asked for. These are the documents that we gave them. So you know what they have, right? These are the employees who they asked to talk to. These were the employees who were available and who we provided to talk to them. I also was making notes of a couple other things, which would be, you can be thoughtful about what records you provide. So certainly you're going to want to provide the records they're asking for, but you don't necessarily have to go give them a whole extra set of records or additional years or records pertaining to employees they didn't ask for. And maybe at some point in time, there will be a benefit to providing additional documentation to explain something after the audit has begun. But at least initially, probably best practice is going to be to just provide what they've asked for. And then you can, when you have a little more time, sit back and think about if any other information would be helpful to the auditor. And then I think also, and I think we're going to get to this a little bit more, talking a bit about, employee interviews. But certainly you can have legal representation, right? So you can call your attorney if you have one. You can have someone come. If they are interviewing employees, you can, in some of those interviews, you are entitled as the business to have counsel there. For
the management level.
Management level folks, right? Because they kind of are the company, right? So there are instances where you can have a lawyer sitting in on the interviews. And I think too that there are some circumstances where if you have a union in your workplace, there might be union reps who can be present for interviews, whether company counsel is or not. So just kind of thinking through, right? In addition to planning and kind of, yes, you want to comply, be courteous, don't resist, but there also are some things you can affirmatively do to kind of protect your business and ensure that where appropriate, your business has a representative present for the process, understands what's happening in the process, and kind of takes good notes and keeps good records of what's happening.
Yeah, you wouldn't want, for example, with documents, to just start handing over documents, and then when the dust settles, somebody somewhere goes, oh my God, we have no idea what documents we've provided, what we haven't, where our documents are, what's missing. So think about, what would stop you from recording, what documents are being handed over, for example, taking photos, recording, so exactly what documents are leaving the office, so you don't have this black hole of missing information.
Yeah, especially if you're giving them original documents, right? So you want to make sure that whatever is given, you have a copy of, you have it there as well. And what's interesting, I think, and really disconcerting for a lot of people is that you might not get a lot of information from the investigator. You might want to be asking the questions like, well, why is this happening? They're not going to tell you, right? There may have been a complaint they received. It may have just been, they saw something on the news, or a customer noted something, or an employee said something. You generally will not have any idea how this thing started. You may want to ask them, what employees of mine have you talked to? They don't have to tell you, other than those management employees. They don't have to give you that information. So there's the employer's a bit of a disadvantage here as to exactly what is going on. But what's important to keep in mind is that this process is not just a one-day thing. They show up and they go through it. It can be months and months and even a year or longer of back and forth between the business and the investigator, making sure that everybody has the right information, making sure that everyone understands exactly what happened. And then after that, some negotiations to figure out exactly, kind of what penalties are going to be imposed. So maybe we should go there next. But
yeah. So we've seen these in the context of a failure to pay overtime. We've seen them with child labor violations, like a whole host of regs that are out there for employers that you better know about and follow if you have youth working for you. I've seen them before with potential nursing mother violations, like a failure to provide private space for nursing mothers. Doug, have you seen
there's minimum wage violations as well. And then another one that we see a lot of are tip pool violations.
Oh, yeah.
So for those tipped employees, there are particular rules about how tip pools can be operated, especially in situations where the employer is taking the tip credit and paying a sub-minimum wage. There's all sorts of special rules about that. So, and all of those violations that Pam mentioned have, not only the amount to be paid to the employee as a potential payment that the employer is going to have to make, an equal amount of liquidated damages on top of that, plus these civil money penalties. And for each of those things that we've talked about, there's a different civil money penalty associated with them. These range from anywhere from $1,300 per violation for record-keeping violations up to $16,000 for child labor violations per violation, and even more than that if there's a serious injury or repeated or willful violations.
Yeah, that's pretty scary.
And I was just I'm gonna throw in a plug, I guess, for having counsel involved in this process that we are discussing, because if you have counsel and they develop a good relationship with the investigator, I think, and I'm speaking a bit for Doug here, but I think it's going to help the business to get as much information as the investigator is willing to share, not necessarily about why they came and what prompted all of this, but in terms of what is the basis for the various penalties or violations they have identified in the audit, and then it also gives the business the best chance of saying, oh, I think there's a misunderstanding about, this issue, and maybe that leads to a violation going away. Or you have some basis why you can say, we don't think those civil penalties are fair in this case, and here's why. So essentially, if you have an attorney who understands the law and the rules, what happened in your case, your particular business, they can then work over this course of time with the investigators and essentially, I think, give the business the best shot at the most fair resolution of something like this. And then also, afterward, maybe help in avoiding this happening again, right? So what were the problems? How do we fix them and things like that?
Yeah, so what would you do if the Department of Labor showed up at your business? I mean, I think if you're listening to this going, whoa, that would be bad. That would be a total nightmare. You can get a plan in place now. And those are things we like to help with. Like, as you can tell by listening to Doug, I mean, he's worked a lot this past year with a number of employers who have been going through this. There are plans and protocols you can get in place. Here's what would happen if someone showed up. This is going to be the point person. This is who we're going to call to assist. The investigator gets escorted into this room. Documents don't get produced until X, Y, and Z. Employees don't get interviewed until X, Y, and Z. I mean, I think there's a lot you could do on the front end to think through this, which could avoid, maybe somewhat of a disaster unfolding if, the wrong documents are produced, a bunch of employees are interviewed, especially management level when you could have had a rep there, but you didn't. So there's a lot you could do on the front end to make sure if something like this happened, you'd be okay at the end of the day.
And probably lessen stress. I mean, it's going to be a stressful experience probably no matter what, but if you have at least given it some thought, the panic mode, right? Hopefully you avoid panic mode. You have an orderly process. Okay, here's what we do.
Yeah. And we were talking a little bit earlier, like what triggers something like this? What I've seen trigger it is unhappy former employees who get fired. I mean, that could trigger something like this. But we also know the Department of Labor has enforcement priorities. Maybe they've targeted certain industries. So it may not be a complaint, but if you're a business where you occasionally have to let someone go, something like that could to trigger something like this.
Yeah, and Pam, you just mentioned what the priorities of the Department of Labor are. I think it's worth kind of taking a second to talk about that because the focus of the Department of Labor is on overtime and minimum wage violation. That's kind of their main focus. And what they want to work on is on low wage, high violation industries. So these are things like agriculture, amusement, childcare, construction, food services, hotels and motels, trucking, utilities, warehousing, temporary help. Those types of industries are the ones where the Department of Labor is more particularly interested in. If you work in, kind of a white collar industry, it's still possible they could come calling, but I think there's significantly less risk than, if you are running a restaurant or a grocery store, for instance.
Yep. Okay, well, that probably gives you enough to think about today. That concludes this episode of Ground Rules. We'll see you next time.
Ground Rules hosts and guests are not providing legal advice in this podcast. Do not act upon any of the information discussed in this podcast without first consulting a licensed attorney in your jurisdiction.